So we're here at the Tea History Collection in Banbury in Oxfordshire, and I'm with Mike Bunston, OBE, and very fortunate to have his fantastic knowledge of tea history. And we're talking about London and the old days of how tea arrived in London into the docks, and also a little bit about Plantation House as well. But we're going to start off with one of the books, which I think actually Mike donated to me. Yes, it's got his name in it, called London's Lost Riverscape, which is a fantastic book of all the docks in London. Mike, if you could just browse over the book and just talk about how tea arrived in the very old days, and then how it kind of developed.
Well, St Catherine Dock was, of course, the most famous dock because that was the one where the tea clippers used to arrive from the east. And what you've got to remember is that China, and it applies to India as well, but in those days it was China, it's a very seasonal crop, and the first teas aren't plucked until about March. So the first crop was going to be very expensive, and it was a great challenge to get your tea into the London auctions before everybody else. And hence the great rise of the tea clippers, which got faster and faster, and there were some wonderful races to get the first lot into London, and at very high price. And of course, if they were the first, it was very profitable for everybody, not least, I suspect, the skipper of the clipper. So there's a whole thing written about that, and it's fascinating. But as the warehouses built up on the riverside, the two probably most famous ones, I think, in my time were Hayes Wharf, which is now Hayes Galleria, one side of Tower Bridge, and Butler's Wharf, which is the other side. Of course, there were many others, but I think probably those were the two biggest and the most famous. All the tea came into the docks, the West India docks. They were brought up by barge to be unloaded into these warehouses where they were all checked and made fit for auction. It was a wonderful scene. I spent a lot of my early time going down with the tea inspectors to the warehouses to look at the teas, again making sure that they were going to be fine for the London auctions. And the characters you met were incredible. It was a wonderful experience, one I shall never forget.
So there were some fun stories I've heard about tea, and obviously those days of China and India, and obviously the opium wars and things. But indeed, when the tea was brought to London in the very early days, it was obviously very, very expensive. It was considered a delicacy, really. And there's a story about the drain pipes on the warehouses, which I don't know whether you told me or whether it was one of our colleagues, but that they were deliberately large, so that tea could be poured down the drain pipe and stolen onto the flatbed lorry.
It's quite believable, because I'm afraid the amount of pilfering that went on in the London docks, right up to really when containerisation came in, I mean, it was a fact. I was always being offered all sorts of goodies from people who'd been down to the docks, watches and jewelry, God knows what. It was an extraordinary place, and I think the dockers were very upset when containerisation came in, because it put a stop to it all. But the drainpipe one is a lovely story. And there were many ways people used to smuggle tea, because, as you say, it was so expensive. Only the royalty and the aristocracy could really afford it in the early days, in the 1660s. And for quite some time. It wasn't really till these other countries like India and Sri Lanka started planting tea and made it more available for everybody that it brought the price of tea down. No, it was an incredibly rare thing. As you know, tea caddies with locks on says it all. Tea had to be protected, because anybody given an opportunity would take a handful. So every way to protect it was taken.
So there's been a nice coincidence. Obviously, my business is based here in Banbury, coincidentally, but explain about the storage of tea, because that actually moved from St Catherine's Dock actually to Banbury.
Yes, indeed, Dennis. Well, when London was no more, really, London docks, and the vessels didn't come, they had to go other places. They went to Southampton, to Bristol, Hull, Southampton, all over, Liverpool. And so the warehouses in London basically ceased, certainly storing tea. Some of them were used for other things, but they're all eventually redeveloped, some into smart flats and all the rest of it. But again, rather like we did with the tea auctions, the tea clearinghouse, who were responsible for the whole thing, said, look, we've got to think what we're going to do here. We've got to put tea in a sensible place where it can come in and go out easily. And a number of warehouses went together and built Banbury Tea warehouses in the 60s, just over the road from where we are today. And I remember many times going to visit it there, and it stored all teas, didn't matter who they were from, but predominantly it was Indian, because India accounted for over 40% of our imports in those days. And in the height of the season, they had up to 900,000 teas stocked any 1 week. Incredible. So serendipity that we should have this tea museum just over the road from what was the largest tea warehouse in England.
Absolutely, and the other piece of serendipity, which is quite extraordinary, is we talked about Plantation House earlier, which held the London tea auctions from 1936 to 1970, a period of 35 years. This wonderful building in London built by J.J. Bunting. But we actually have managed to save some items from this building. I've got a photo here of the tea auction, which our viewers will be able to see. But do you want to explain about the plaques?
Yes, I will. So this wonderful auditorium, which took over 2 floors, and I forget how. I mean, at the height of when there were a lot of dealers in London. You know, basically London was the centre of the Western tea world. So all tea came into London, and we had a massive re-export. I mean, most of the teas that America and Canada consumed came through the London auction. So there were many companies trading in tea. But round the top of the auction, of the auditorium, there were these incredible plaques representing the major tea producing and major tea consuming countries. I think there were something like 30 all around the building. And when it all closed down and the whole building was redeveloped, they were ripped down. And but somebody in the tea trade managed to save 4 of them. It was a miracle, because I think all the others, I'm pretty certain all the others got lost, put into skips or whatever. But these 4 were kept, and for a long time were almost in hiding, and until we suddenly realised that they were in danger of also ending up in a skip. So we set to work to make contact with people who we thought could help. And luckily we did, and again, to cut a long story short, they are now here in the museum, and we are in the collection, and we are very grateful to all those people who worked hard to save them. Such an important part of our history.
And so just as a final point on tea, and obviously bringing it up to kind of today, of how that is auctioned and handled, from what I understand, obviously a lot of it's done on the internet or direct. People like Unilever own their own tea estates, and shipments would go directly into the Unilever factory in the United Kingdom. So in a way, the whole tea auction and shipping into St Katharine's Dock method of transport and supply chain, if you like, has completely changed, being much more direct now.
Oh, absolutely. Although, of course, all the producing countries, all the major producing countries, have their own auction centres. India have about 4 auction centres. Colombo is the biggest auction centre in the world. Mombasa is extremely big for the whole of Africa. And still, they are sold in the traditional way. But I think more and more people are looking at the possibility of doing it electronically. And of course, with all the lockdown with COVID, I think that progressed it, and a lot of stuff is now sold online. Whether I'm not quite, I mean, it's very interesting with the antiques now that if you go to any auction antique house, they've all got online bidding, and that is a thing that is really, you know, it means the whole world know what's available. And so it's inevitable that's going to happen with tea. But I think the only thing with tea is that the people involved in tea, of course, in a way know all that anyway. But it's still going to move that way, I think. But I personally, call me old-fashioned, there's nothing like being an auctioneer and seeing all the buyers around you, and within seconds you've got a feel, you know what's going to happen at that auction that day. And I think that's very difficult to capture online. But nevertheless, there's definitely a place for it, and it's going to happen. Well, it is happening already.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis.